Good morning, friends. Blessings to you all today. Today's readings come from Joshua 22, the English Standard Version. The first reading is from Joshua 22, 1 through 6. At that time, Joshua summoned the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half-tribe of Manasseh and said to them, "You have kept all that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you and have obeyed my voice in all that I have commanded you. You have not forsaken your brothers these many days, down to this day, but have been careful to keep the charge of the Lord your God. And now the Lord your God has given rest to your brothers and has promised them. Therefore, turn and go to your tents in the land where your possession lies, which Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you on the other side of the Jordan. Only be very careful to observe the commandment and the law that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, to love the Lord your God and to walk in all his ways and to keep his commandments and to cling to him and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul." So Joshua blessed them and sent them away, and they went to their tents. And now, Joshua 22, 10 through 12. And when they came to the region of the Jordan that is in the land of Canaan, the people of Reuben and the people of Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh built there an altar by the Jordan, an altar of imposing size. And the people of Israel heard it, said, "Behold, the people of Reuben and the people of Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh have built the altar at the frontier of the land of Canaan, in the region about the Jordan, on the side that belongs to the people of Israel." And when the people of Israel heard of it, the whole assembly of the people of Israel gathered at Shiloh to make war against them. And finally, Joshua 22, 21 through 30. Then the people of Reuben, the people of Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh said in answer to the heads of the families of Israel, "The mighty one, God, the Lord, the mighty one, God, the Lord. He knows, and let Israel itself know. It was in rebellion or in breach of faith against the Lord. Do not spare us today for building an altar to turn away from following the Lord. Or if we did so to offer burnt offerings or grain offerings or peace offerings on it, may the Lord himself take vengeance. No, but we did it from fear that in time to come your children might say to our children, 'What have you to do with the Lord, the God of Israel?' For the Lord has made the Jordan a boundary between us and you, you people of Reuben and people of Gad. You have no portion in the Lord. So your children might make our children cease to worship the Lord. Therefore we said, 'Let us now build an altar, not for burnt offering, not for sacrifice, but to be a witness between us and you, and between our generations after us, that we do perform the service of the Lord in the presence with our burnt offerings and sacrifices and peace offerings. So your children will not say to our children in time to come, "You have no portion in the Lord." And we thought, if this be said to us or to our descendants in time to come, we should say, "Behold the copy of the altar of the Lord, which our fathers made, not for burnt offerings nor for sacrifice, but to be a witness between us and you. Far be it from us that we should rebel against the Lord and turn away this day from following the Lord by building an altar for burnt offering, grain offering, or sacrifice, other than the altar of the Lord our God that stands before his tabernacle." When Phinehas, the priest, and the chiefs of the congregation, the heads of the families of Israel, who were with him, heard the words the people of Reuben and the people of Gad and the people of Manasseh spoke, it was good in their eyes. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. You may be seated.
Outstanding work. Well, it's good to be with you this morning. I noticed the choir spared no expense with an orchestra of one. And Jordan, the choir director, went away. And our senior pastor went to Scotland. All because I'm here. So, no, they're all in the places they should be. And God ministered through the choir this morning and the cello. It was cello, right? Okay. Just checking. As we've seen over the last few weeks, Oh, by the way, I need to say this too. Short passage this morning. You're welcome. She doesn't feel so. As we've seen over the past few weeks, the people of Israel have finally reached a pause in the movement into Canaan. I say that it's a pause because as Joshua said in chapter 13, as he was about to apportion out the land to the 9.5 tribes, he alerts us to the fact that there's still pockets of enemies that are around that they need to take care of. For example, the Jebusites still control the city of Jerusalem, and that will remain so until David himself roots them out and creates the city of David at Jerusalem. Nonetheless, the command is that they need to finish the work of these people, or these people will end up corrupting Israel with their false gods and idols. But to make sure that we kind of catch all this pause and all this stuff, I want to go back and look a little bit in their past of what happened. As the people of Israel were approaching the edge of Canaan, they ended up defeating two very powerful foes that they ran into just on the east side of the Jordan River. Their first great victory was over the Amorite kingdom of King Sihon. They then defeated King Og of the larger kingdom of Bashan. Having defeated the two groups blocking their way into Canaan, they needed only to cross the Jordan River to begin their campaign of acquiring their homeland. But before they actually crossed the Jordan, these three groups came to Moses, members and leaders of Gad, members and leaders of Reuben, and of the half tribe of Manasseh. They came privately to Moses and they said, "We would like to take this land on the east side of the Jordan. This land is very fertile. It's very good for raising cattle and crops, and we just want to settle on the east side of the Jordan." Now, Moses' initial response was kind of sarcastic a little bit. So you're telling me you want to just settle into this land and leave your brothers and sisters to fight it out with all these nations on the other side of the Jordan. Is that what you're kind of saying to me? And they said, no, this is not our plan at all. We will send our warriors with you, and they will stay with you until the land is acquired. And when the land is fully acquired, then they will come back home. So in Numbers 32, we have these words from Moses. Moses answered, "Do what you have said. In the Lord's presence, have all your armed men get ready for battle. Have them cross the Jordan and fight until the Lord forces out his enemies and the land is conquered. Then you may come back. You will have fulfilled your military duty to the Lord and Israel. This land will be your own property in the Lord's presence." And so that is exactly what they do. And the wars for Canaan begin with the crossing of the Jordan and the destroying of Jericho. Now, chapter 22, our passage today, occurs 5 years later, with Joshua now having a meeting with these leaders, and they ask, and he gives to them permission to return home. He says, "You have affirmed and done everything you promised Moses, and have helped me as I've done this acquiring of the land, so you can go back." But he gives them two pieces of advice. First, he says, spiritually speaking, you need to understand that even though we're not together, you need to follow all the commandments and statutes that the Lord gave to you through Moses. In fact, the language is very similar to the Shema. You know the Shema, the Lord, Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and your soul and your mind. And in this particular thing, he tells them to cling to God, serve him with all their heart and soul. Now, the second thing that he tells them is to be sure and take with them the fruit of their faithfulness. For example, they need to take wealth, silver, gold, bronze, and iron that had been acquired through war. He says you need to break with all the livestock that you've gathered over this period of time. And then he actually says, and take a lot of clothes. I don't know why, but it seemed to be a good thing. I don't know. So all the warriors from Manasseh, Gad, and Reuben, half tribe of Manasseh, who have fought with their brothers for these many years, gather their supplies, head back across the Jordan to be reunited with their families. Now, they had stopped long enough. We don't deal with the length of time, but they had stopped long enough to fortify cities and to get the places available for their families, their children, and their wives. But they now are on the other side of the Jordan, and at some point in this time, they decide to build an altar. It's a replica of the altar that sits in front of the tabernacle. And it is an altar that in the front of the tabernacle for all the burnt offerings and sacrifices that take place. The altar that they create is said to be of imposing size, so it is clearly visible to people on the western side of the river as well as the eastern side. Now, the altar in Shiloh, that's where the tabernacle is, it is square, and if I did my math right, it's 7.5 feet long by 7.5 feet wide and about 4.5 feet high. I have on the screen here a rendition of this altar. You can see the horns there, and you can see the dimensions as well. So this is where they would do the sacrifices. They would cut animals up and they would put them in there and burn them for the sacrifice and throw the blood against it as well. Well, word got back to the leaders of the tribes on the western side of the Jordan about this large replica of the altar, and their immediate assumption was that they are making sacrifices just as if they're in front of the tabernacle, the real tabernacle in Shiloh. And they think, therefore, they've created worship competition against the tabernacle, God's holy place. And so they immediately gather their warriors. They show up at Shiloh, and they are ready to go to war on behalf of God and for Joshua. So that leads me to my first point this morning. Faithfulness within may not be recognized without. Now, I like that. I said that pretty good, I think. So I'm going to say that again. Faithfulness within may not be recognized without. It's interesting to note that one of the first things that we learn in chapter 22 is that the warriors from these 2.5 tribes have been through the whole process of helping them win over Canaan. They kept their promise to Moses and to Joshua. For the whole time that the tribes have been at war, they have fought alongside their brothers and have helped them win the Canaan land. And I don't think we should forget they left all their families back on the eastern side. They have been apart from their families for over 5 years. Now, you might say, how do you know it's 5 years? Well, I'm not good at math, but there is a passage where it says Caleb asked for his portion of land. You remember that? These people, okay. This is interactive every now and then, okay? Help me. Okay. Now, Caleb, while he's talking to Joshua, he said, I was 40 years old when I went out as a spy with Joshua and the other 10. And he said, now I'm 85 years old. You can do the math, right? 40 when he went out as a spy. 40 years wandering in the wilderness. 85. Just saying. 5 years. Okay. They've been faithful all that time. And yet, when the western tribes hear that an altar has been built on the eastern side of the river by these 2.5 tribes, the immediate response is, they're messing up, they're doing another tabernacle, let's kill them. It's kind of one of those, what have you done for me lately attitudes. All the good that they had done previously, all the battles that they had fought side by side with their brothers, all the goodwill that they had done, gone in a heartbeat. Because they had an imposing altar sitting there by the river. Now let me bring this to the present day. I want to share with you this morning that being a Christian can sometimes feel just like this. We can be living the Christian life faithfully over a significant period of time, doing what we think is right, and then someone takes exception to what we do or say, and they are immediately ready to go to war against us. There may be times when our behavior or pattern of life comes into question by those very people whom we have attended church with all these many years. And even though they don't have access to our mind and our heart, they choose to misinterpret, to misrepresent, to misinform perhaps others in the church about our faithfulness to Christ and our life as Christians. Now, my wife, Sherry, calls this church hurt. Did I say that right? Church hurt. Okay? Now, she probably didn't make that phrase up, but I'll give her credit. I know she didn't. The fact is, there's only one who truly knows our hearts and motives. He is the only one worthy of judging and being jury. In Jeremiah 17, God's talking to Jeremiah, and he says, the heart is sick, and you can't understand it. But he follows it with this: I, the Lord, search the heart and test the mind to give every man according to his ways, according to the fruit of his deeds. And you remember the story of seeking David? How so many of the brothers came in front of Samuel, and Samuel kept saying, oh, that's it, that's it. God kept saying, no, that's not it. And then finally, God speaks to Samuel, and he says to him, you look on the outward appearance, the height of his stature, but I've rejected him, for the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. Point is that I want to make is this kind of attitude of judgment that we can sometimes make about people because we think we see them doing something wrong is very dangerous. The reason Jesus said, don't judge or you will be judged, or told the crowd, let the one who is perfect throw the first stone at the adulteress, is because the only truly righteous and holy judge is our Lord. We don't want to make mistakes considering judging other people's hearts and motives. So my advice to you, if you feel church hurt, is remain faithful to Christ. Love the Lord with all your heart, soul, and might. And just know that sometimes you might be misunderstood anyway. That's okay. It's not their approval that's important. It's His approval that counts. Defend yourself with love, reason, and patience, and God will honor your faithfulness. My next 2 points deals with those who are making the judgments here. The second thing we need to remember this morning is that being righteous can be a two-edged sword. This is going to be really tough to get through, so I'm just saying, Jared. Okay, I'll summarize. The fact is, God's covenant with Israel required that they love God with all their being and they love their neighbor the way that they love themselves. The practical result of this was that they should keep themselves away from temptation and be careful to act in ways that honor God. These requirements, by the way, are true for all of us Christians today. The struggle to be faithful has been an ongoing issue for the people of Israel. And during this time frame where they're kind of aggressively speaking to these 2.5 tribes, they bring up 2 incidences where Israel has failed. One is at Baal Peor, which is a place where they began to hang out with Moabite women, to marry them, to eat with them, attend sacrifices, and even bow down to their gods. And the result is that God brings judgment on them, and that's what they mention here. Phinehas is the leader of the accusing delegation. He was a hero at Peor because he executed a couple that flaunted their stance against God. The second major failure mentioned here is the sin of Achan, and we know the story of Jericho and how even though it was devoted to absolute destruction, Israel was not able to defeat other foes because Achan had taken wealth out of there and clothing and hidden them for himself. The lesson that comes out of this is that God judges the community of Israel both for the individual sin and also for community sin. And so I want to say to you this morning that sometimes our congregation and the power of our congregation can be hurt by individual sin, as well as community sin, sins that are done by the whole. Now, I want to be clear. The Western tribes are right to make sure that the altar was not built in rebellion and as a competition to the true altar at Shiloh. It is actually good that they stood faithful. But the lesson is that we can never become judge and jury. We can never move ourselves into a place of self-righteousness. And that's why we have to be very, very careful. It's a short step from trying to win someone back over and also going into self-righteousness. Several verses come to my mind. For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you not to think of himself more highly than he ought to, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. Or do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. So the first thing that we have to look at is if we're going to be faithful stewards and stand for the right, we also have to be people of humility. The third thing I would say this morning, we should always be aware that hasty judgments and decisions can lead us to the edge of disaster. They immediately assumed that these people were in sin. They did not understand that the altar was merely a place representing God. It was not a place where they were doing the kinds of things that they were not supposed to do. I call this rushing to judgment. Sherry told me that. Now, I could say there are lots of practical examples here, but a very important point needs to be made here. The tribes prepared to go to war against 2.5 tribes, but before doing so, they stopped and sent a delegation over to find out the truth. That's so critical to us. They did not, in fact, act in haste. They did not, in fact, go to war with them. And there are plenty of passages that talk about not being hasty. Be not rash with your mouth, nor let your heart be hasty to utter a word before God. For God is in heaven and you are on earth. Therefore let your words be few, Ecclesiastes tells us. Or do you see a man who is hasty in his words? There is more hope for a fool than for him, Proverbs tells us. Paul even made the point, don't be too hasty in the laying on of hands for clergy. Make sure that you're careful in the way that you deal with that. He wrote that to Timothy, who was helping develop a church. Here are 3 practical ways to protect yourself from being hasty. In the immediate moment that you're in conflict, count to 10. Just a very practical point, right? Number 2, allow yourself to recenter by waiting a day or 2 before you respond. Always helpful to give yourself time to come back down. Finally, pray about the situation until you're no longer driven by emotion. Now, the last thing that I would say today, and I've got just seconds. Symbols that witness are good, but they carry risk. The purpose of the altar was to be a remembrance so that they would remember the fact that they're the people of God. And they were also given, as you heard in the reading, they were given there because the people in the east were afraid that later their children would be talked to by the children in the west. And the children in the west would say, you can't have a part of us because you're not one of us. But they are the same bloodline. They come from the same covenant. And so this was a reminder. So there are numbers of things that we could say about this, but building altars is not abnormal in Israel's history. There are lots of cases, Noah, Abraham, Jacob, and Moses. But the danger always is there that we can take that altar and we can make it something more important to us than God. Symbols are great. Symbols are wonderful. But they can never become the most important thing in our lives. Remember the verses in Deuteronomy where God is speaking to Moses. He says, you didn't see the Lord the day He spoke to you from the fire at Mount Horeb. So be very careful that you don't become corrupt and make your own carved idols. Don't make statues that represent men or women, any animal or creature, anything that flies, any creature that crawls, anything in the water. He goes on to warn them not to worship the stars and the sun. At the same time, God says there are things you can use as symbols. In Deuteronomy 6, He says, take to heart the words that I give you today. Repeat them to your children. Talk about them when you're at home or away, when you lie down or get up. Write them down, tie them around your wrist, wear them as headbands as a reminder. Write them on the door frames of your hearts and houses and on your gates. Symbols can be wonderful visuals for spiritual principles, but they can also become idols in our life if we're not careful. So many ways that I would want to share this more with you. One thing I would say is just remember Numbers 21. They put those fiery serpents came to punish Israel for doing evil and going into idolatry. And so people were dying, and God said to Moses, put a serpent on top of the pole. As long as they look at it in faith, they will be healed. Years later, Hezekiah had to destroy that very serpent because people were worshiping it. I'm saying to you today, we need to build, like I was talking about in the sermon I did many Wednesdays ago, where they crossed the Jordan River and put 12 stones inside to say, this is where God provided for us. And they took 12 stones out and they put them at Shiloh that said, this is where God provided for us. Those are great things. We should put symbols out. We should set up stakes that say, this is where God did great things for me. But it can never replace God Himself. He is the central focus, and the worship always comes to Him. Okay, so I'm stopping. All right. Conclusion. I have to have a conclusion. 4 points. We are called to be faithful even when others misunderstand us or misread us. Stay faithful. 2, we are to be a holy people, but never, ever holier than thou. Humility, primary principle. Number 3, being hasty in decision making can end up in disaster, so pray and go slow and go in love. And lastly, symbols are great, but can be dangerous. Jesus is the one who we follow. Amen.